for picking up where others have ended. So I'm going to pick up from the previous panel and actually to mention Kirill Rogov's question, suggestion that the biggest challenge today for Putin is to seek for ways to bring his popularity up to those that he enjoyed after Crimea annexation. I would also offer a way to redirect that challenge a little bit, reword that challenge a little bit, that besides that we can also see it as a challenge, not necessarily to up the popularity rankings, but certainly to avert blame laying for deteriorating standards of living. And these mechanisms we see on Russian media, in Kremlin's political communication, evolving pretty much every day. And it's a challenge that is being attempted to be met on a daily basis. And this is what I will try to suggest, at least one idea of how it is being done in today's Russia. Let me also, before going into my story, offer a metaphor of Putinism, or Putin's regime, as an iceberg that has certainly grown upwards after Crimea annexation and has shifted downwards in size of ice after it. But the iceberg having a big underwater component, that we have not yet talked about. And you might be familiar with the term deep state. I'm not going to be talking about deep state. I will be bringing your attention to deep stories or deep ideas that I see as underpinning the regime, and thus adding just another nuance to the story of Putinism. Those of us who watch and participate in Russian social media on Facebook have, of course, noticed that almost every year now, around September time, there is a flash mob, your 90s. People put out their pictures, people put out their stories. If you look a little further, you also will be familiar with the initiative by Yeltsin Center and Kolta.ru, Island of the 90s, Ostrov 90, the festival that is there to celebrate the 1990s, to remember the 1990s, to create meaning around the 1990s. On the other hand, if you are not on social media but on Russian TV, and God forbid you watch Вечер с Владимиром Соловьевым, what you confront, you can go to November 13th and November 15th, 2018 talk shows, for example. You confront 1 to 2 hours programming focused on discussing the 1990s. If you turn to youth music, and we talked about rap, well, you might want to listen to Монеточка, Елизавета Курдымова. Then you also find out that one of the very successful songs and successful clips that she has is about the 1990s. We might think the 90s were recent, and besides the Generation Z, everyone has gone through it and knows pretty well what happened in their lives in the 1990s and what the 1990s have looked like. Well, I would submit to you that right now in Russia we are confronting the situation that the 1990s have been turned into myth, have been mythologized. So even if you have lived through the 1990s and you know that all the complexities and the nuances, both positive and negative, the dominant idea, the dominant discourse about the 1990s that has been promoted by the Kremlin through state-controlled media is the idea about the 90s being dreadful, is the idea about the 90s being terrible, disorderly, anarchic, criminal, violent, devastating to Russia, devastating to the country, devastating to the economy, devastating to the people. And basically what I argue in my memo is that we need to look at the stories about the 1990s as central today to the process of collective identity construction in Russia, as a deep story that is used to produce common political sense shared by majority, taken for granted by majority, as a chosen trauma that plays an important pillar of national identity, as a frame used by the Kremlin to legitimize the regime, as a glue that connects people to the regime and the status quo on the emotional basis, based on understanding of the shared pain and the portrayal of Russia's current authority structure as the one that is defined by its opposition to the liberal reforms of the 1990s. The frame is captured in Russian language, but it's a frame. The content that is put into that frame could differ depending on the media spokesperson, a leader, or individuals who talk about the 90s. They could talk about unemployment, they could talk about fragmentation of Russia, they could talk about traitorous elites, they could talk about the West taking advantage of Russia, they could talk about very different things, but the frame is the same. And this is the frame that provides, if I may suggest, an original grace to Putin and Putinism. If there's a term original sin, this is the original grace that he builds on. Pavlovsky, the originator of the electoral strategy of presidential elections in 2000, did very consciously embed the juxtaposition of Putin to the 1990s as an electoral strategy. When he came to power, when presidential elections ended successfully, that idea went away. Putin was a liberal economic reformer, continuing administrative reforms, etc., etc., etc. But it's interesting how from an electoral strategy very quickly, the idea of the 90s turned into a very powerful legitimation tool that is used today, almost 20 years after those original elections, in modern Russia. And we see Kremlin's operators very well understanding the value and the political stakes involved in the conversation in the 1990s. And it's not for nothing that Solovyov spends 2 hours of his talk show bringing experts to talk about the 1990s. God forbids you are on the liberal side, like Boris Nadezhdin, then you are shouted at, then you are accused and blamed and finger-pointed by a very aggressively determined Solovyov. And I would submit to you that this is the mechanism and the strategy that the Kremlin uses almost on a daily basis to avert the blame from the current Russian government and to lay the blame on the liberals in the 1990s and the reforms of the 1990s, thus further embedding the original grace of the regime, using it to perpetuate stability, and thus representing the underlying underwater part of the iceberg. And I will just leave you with the reference to Zakharov and Chubai's very recent debate, again on social media, following the Gaidar Readings Forum, and the debate that definitely went, spilled over the communication between Zakharova and Chubais himself. Solovyov jumped in, there were many others who jumped in. The Bell, Yekaterina Elizaveta Osetinskaya's media jumped in, taking sides in the debate, trying to suggest who is right, who is wrong, what are the facts on the ground. But you know, in the current environment of inequality and social justice becoming very important issues of the day in Russia, the 1990s is that foundational stone and the scarecrow for the Russian people, and the foundational stone for the regime that allows the continuing patching up and the continuing transformation of the upper echelons of that iceberg, but while keeping the original grace intact. That's the idea I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we have Andrey Makarychev of the University of Tartu.
Thank you very much. Well, my story today will take a little bit away from what Gulnaz presented, but it's still beyond Kremlin, but also beyond Russia. So I'm going to focus mostly on the phenomena which seems to be quite an interesting object of research. It's an opposition at a distance, or different groups of people who do politics beyond Russia. And that's, in fact, a very interesting phenomena in the sense that, as we know, an increasing number of Russians are moving out of the country, and according to statistics, it's 1/3 of a million that left country in 2017, which is a triple rise in comparison to 2012. So we do have a growing number of Russians who prefer to live beyond the country. In the meantime, we also have this network or patchwork of different groups, foundations like Open Russia Foundation, the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom, Free Russia Forum, etc., that operate beyond Russia, and they try to challenge the regime at a distance. So that's exactly this non-Russian-based opposition which is subject to my attention today. And more specifically, I will focus on three issues related to the way how they operate and what they say, what they think. The first is how they understand politics. Secondly, how they understand change in Russia, and thirdly, how they understand Russian role beyond Russia, kind of constructing an alternative, non-Kremlin-based, non-Kremlin patronized Russian role. So starting with the first point, what is politics and whether politics at a distance is in principle possible? Well, they do have an answer to that, and the answer seems to be quite radical. For most people like Leonid Nevzlin or Garry Kasparov, there is no way to do politics in Russia. Doing politics in Russia is impossible because there is no freedom. And for them, freedom is a precondition for political existence. I can give you just an example of Leonid Nevzlin, who mentioned a couple of times in his recent interviews that in Russia all political institutions are destroyed, including electoral and legal. What is needed is a total re-establishment of the state. And this total re-establishment of the state, according to this type of discourse, is impossible from within. And another interesting quotation from Ivan Tutin, who represents Free Russia Forum. There are only few people in Russia who are capable of being effective in a future democratic transition of Russia. Just a few people who are able to make difference. So if politics in Russia is impossible, the real politics is kind of deployed beyond Russian national jurisdiction. And again, an interesting quotation from Garry Kasparov: "Ours is not a struggle for the right to paint benches in one color or another." Yeah, it's not politics. And people who think that this is politics, they are radically wrong. Our politics is real politics. And he refers to Free Russia Forum on an annual basis held in Vilnius as the quintessential political development. So if we take this discourse at the face value, what would be the strategy? The strategy would be to help people, critically thinking people, and people who are in disagreement with the regime to leave Russia and to find a new political existence beyond the country. And if you look at, for example, Free Russia houses located in Kiev, in Warsaw, they're very much kind of pursuing this type of strategy. And quite recently, an association for support of immigrants was founded in Latvia, etc. So it seems to be like a strategy to bring as many people as possible beyond Russia, to make them leave Russia, and to help adapt into new environment. Of course, this is not the only strategy, because if you look more attentively at different narratives within this network of opposition at a distance, of course there are other strategies of helping people within Russia to make changes. The Boris Nemtsov Fund for Freedom, they do invest in communicating with people from Russia and helping them to increase their political skills and political capabilities to operate within Russia. And even some people would claim that, for example, Free Russia Forum in the distant future might become a kind of prototype for a political party in Russia to operate within the country under changed circumstances. So that was my point number one. Point number two, scenario for the future. So if politics in Russia is impossible, if Russia represents a kind of depoliticized, totalized society ruled by authoritarian elite, so how this repoliticization might happen? And the answers are very controversial. Well, generally speaking, these impulses should come from overseas, from the outside. And the key issue here is the isolation of the regime and the shrinkage of Putin's resource base as a strategy. A lot of efforts is invested in symbolic politics, like renaming urban places in commemoration of Boris Nemtsov, for example, and there are some other lobbying efforts in OSCE that call upon international supervision of the murder of Nemtsov. Then there are many countries in which new legislation was introduced to increase the level of personal restrictions and sanctions, etc. And some of the opposition leaders trying to present their activity as conducive to what Garry Kasparov called Putin's major defeat, and its campaign for preventing Russian General Alexander Prokopchuk from being elected at the head of the Interpol. So they think that this is somehow related to their campaign against that. Public shaming is also part of this strategy of change. Free Russia Forum runs two different projects on that. One is Baza, which is basically a database on public servants, judges, and security officers involved in operational freedoms in Russia. Then there is Putin's List, also run by Free Russia Forum, and a project named Dossier, operated by Open Russia by Mikhail Khodorkovsky. It's basically about naming people who are complicit in human rights violation in Russia. And the third point here is whether a different Russian world is possible, since there is a growing Russian community, and a very significant part of this community is very dissatisfied with the way how Russian world is presented or promoted from the Kremlin. Yes, that's an important point, and many of these protagonists of my story, they were quite clearly trying to position themselves as representing a different Russia, a new Russia, a non-Putin Russia, etc. But in the meantime, I think it's also a very controversial issue, and I'll just give you two examples, and I'll stop at this point. One was the festival which was named Slovo Nova, run by Marat Gelman in Montenegro, with the slogan, Russia without shores. Well, I think as a cultural metaphor it might work, but in the meantime it also resembles very much a famous or infamous Putin's kind of remark of Russia having no borders, just literally a few months ago. So playing with this shoreless Russia metaphor might be a little bit controversial for Baltic countries, for Ukraine, for Belarus, for Caucasus, etc. So my point is that not all members of the opposition of the dissident, they're sensitive to these cultural issues, and they produce metaphors that might not necessarily resonate in neighboring countries. And the second example is Evgenia Chirikova, who is known as one of the activists of the Khimkinski Les, this environmental movement. She lives now in Estonia, and just a couple of years after moving in Estonia, she kind of published an open letter to the Estonian president saying that, yeah, the integration policy in Estonia is not perfect, and it takes so much effort to study and to learn Estonian language, etc., etc. Well, that resembles a little bit of the mainstream discourse in the Kremlin. It's repeated that it's translated for opposition figures that, in fact, in this respect, are not that much different from the Russian world patronized and sponsored by the Kremlin. So I will stop here.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. So next we have Kelly McMann from Case Western Reserve University.
Good morning. So the question that was posed for us today is Russia in 2019, what lies ahead? And in Andrey's talk about opposition outside of Russia, in many of the talks from the first panel, there were a lot of different ways to approach this question. I'm going to approach it yet in a different way, and that is to ask, could Russia go the way of Mexico? And there's some solid reasons for asking this question. First of all, many people have drawn parallels between United Russia and the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, especially in its past. So both of these have been labeled dominant parties in the sense that they've held power for extended periods of time, and that they ensured that while opposition could remain in the country, it never took national power. Also, there's a solid reason for the comparison between the two countries, because in both countries, the relationship between the national government and the subnational governments has always been a key issue. So in many ways, Russia now is where Mexico was with the decline of the PRI, so throughout the 1970s and 1990s. And we all know how that ended, right? So the PRI actually lost power, the opposition came into to win the presidency, and many people now label Mexico a full democracy, although one with many problems. So could we expect the same thing for Russia with this dominant party system and with the situation of facing similar challenges? So to preview my answer is no, because the responses to the challenges that were used by the PRI in Mexico are very different from the responses that Putin, along with United Russia, are using to respond to challenges today. So let me run through this argument. First of all, let's take a look at how similar United Russia is actually to the PRI during its heyday, especially in the 1950s and 1960s. There's one key difference. United Russia is an instrument of the Russian president, whereas in Moscow, the presidents were, in Mexico, the presidents were an instrument of the PRI. So very different power structure in that respect. So whereas Putin has used United Russia to push his agenda through the Duma and the regional assemblies, both of which have been filled with loyalists as represented by United Russia members, the PRI also controlled the legislature, but it ensured that the presidents abided by its agenda. So the presidents of Mexico were largely figureheads, and the PRI held the real power. Despite that key difference between the two situations, United Russia with Putin and the PRI in Mexico have used many of the same tactics to maintain power. First of all, they've made an effort to stifle opposition, but at the same time to allow it, because it allows for the claim that the countries have a pluralist system of government. But they make sure the opposition can never win power. So both in Mexico historically and today in Russia, we've seen electoral laws been altered, state control of the media, sometimes the falsification of electoral results, and the imprisonment and violence against activists and journalists. So all these tactics we've seen in both countries to stifle the opposition. Now the other second common tactic between the two is the use of state resources for patronage. In both countries, the purpose was to co-opt potential and actual opposition members, and to make sure votes were secured for the PRI in Mexico and United Russia in Russia. Interestingly, patronage had a different distribution structure in the two countries. So in Russia, as we know, state resources are distributed to loyal subnational officials. Their loyalty is demonstrated by their membership in United Russia and also their ability to secure votes for the Kremlin. In Mexico, in contrast, patronage, these state resources were distributed during the PRI's heyday to organize groups. So it was urban labor unions, peasant federations that received state resources with the same goal of having to secure votes for the leading party. Now, both of these countries have faced similar challenges, and I'm talking here in Mexico about the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and in Russia currently, well, in recent years. So both have faced mass protest, decreased regime legitimacy, public disgust over electoral fraud, and economic decline. So you may recall in Mexico in 1968, there were huge student-led protests. The regime responded by killing about 200 protesters that led to a significant drop in legitimacy. People lost even more faith in the PRI and the government as a whole when they viewed that the 1988 presidential election was stolen from the opposition. Mexico then experienced in that era a debt crisis, and then in 1995 a financial crisis, and its middle class lost significant gains. As people who follow and are experts on Russia, the story is somewhat similar in that country in recent years. We saw the protests in 2011 and 2012, mass protests. People were concerned about electoral fraud, about the legislative election results. They were frustrated with Putin's castling announcement. And for these reasons, there was a drop in regime legitimacy. Further protests occurred over in protest of corruption as a result of Navalny releasing the video about Medvedev and his business dealings. We've seen in recent years economic decline that's led to losses in standard of living for Russians. So considering the similarities in structure between the two countries and the similarities in challenges, we might predict a happy scenario for Russia in the sense that just as these situations led to political liberalization in Mexico, that might occur in Russia as well. But it's unlikely because the government's responses are very different. So the approach the PRI took in the 1970s and 1990s as it was facing these challenges was to grant concessions to the opposition. They undertook electoral reforms, so many electoral reforms that the opposition came to win quite a bit. Initially in the municipalities, the PRI allowed this because they wanted people to be able to let off steam about these frustrations they had with the regime. So perhaps there's a similarity to the recent Kremlin losses in the fall elections, but we'll have to wait and see. I don't think that's going to happen. The scenario in Mexico was that these municipalities then, municipality wins by the opposition snowballed into a win of the lower house of Congress. Then the 2000 presidential elections, the opposition took power. And with that alternation of power in the highest office in the land, Mexico has been considered a complete democracy, although one with problems. By contrast, the response in Russia, as we know, has been to squash the opposition, not to facilitate it, not to grant concessions. So we know about the restrictions on public protests, the use of the anti-extremism law and preventative detention against activists, the nationalist campaigns domestically to boost popularity, so the ties to the church, the anti-homosexual legislation, the foreign agent law against Western NGOs, and then we also know about the nationalist campaign outside of Russia's borders, the annexation of Crimea, and the fomenting of separatism in Ukraine. So a very different approach in Russia to addressing challenges. So despite the similar structure in the national parties and these dominant parties, despite the similar amount of attention that has to be paid to center-periphery relations in the countries, I don't think we can expect to see a Mexico scenario of political liberalization and ultimately democratization in Russia in the near future. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So next we have Sarah Wilson Sokhey from University of Colorado Boulder.
Russia today, and I think I'll be talking loudly enough, but I'll try to direct it into the microphone. So I've titled this Social Policy in what might be Putin's last term, and what I'll talk about are policies like healthcare, education, and pensions, so something that doesn't get a lot of coverage in Western news. Understandably, that's not the focus of what Western media is reporting about, but what I would argue is a really vitally important topic to understand, both because first, it's important in its own right. The quality of people's lives depend on social policies like pensions, healthcare, and education, but also because it gives us insight into how regimes operate and how they work, and also how authoritarian regimes like what exists in Russia today, how those regimes operate. And so the picture that I have here, maybe one you know, the big news, the big recent news from Russia is that they raised the retirement age last year. This was largely unexpected in that, understandably unexpected, Putin in the middle there. This is not something you typically see, but a picture of him, and it says public enemy, or enemy of the people. Putin had spent nearly 20 years promising not to do this. There was not a hint of it in the run-up to the election, which is not surprising. That's probably strategic. You don't hint you're going to do massively unpopular things right before you want to get reelected by a large margin. And so they raised the retirement age, and there were these protests in the summer, and they did it very strategically, the timing of when it's introduced. But they raised the retirement age, and a lot of Western commentators really thought that maybe this could undermine Putin, right? That maybe this could bring him down. And my big point today is that social policy in Russia might not be great in a lot of regards that we would want it to be, and Russians are aware of this. They're a savvy public in a lot of ways, but we really shouldn't expect, despite pictures like this, for it to bring the Putin regime down moving forward. So if our question today to answer is what's going to happen in 2019, I really doubt that you're going to see raising the retirement age bring down the Putin regime, or even though it has affected his popularity in the short term. And so I'll talk a little bit more here just about raising the retirement age in Russia, because it was so unexpected and is a really very recent development of just the last 6 months. So a month after Putin gets re-elected in March of 2018, or about a month afterwards, and during the World Cup, which is nice timing. So if you're going to do something massively unpopular, you should do it right after you get re-elected for what might be your last term, and you should do it during the World Cup if you can. And so Medvedev is actually the one who introduces a proposal to raise the retirement age, and there's an immediate backlash. There's protests across Russia. You can see here people are holding the signs, of course, for the circle and no to 65 and 63, because that was the initial proposal for how much to raise the retirement age. So they do this at a strategic time. There are these protests, but they push it through the legislative system really pretty quickly. By October of 2018, so they introduce it in June, October, it's done, right? They've had protests. They do make some concessions. So they don't raise the retirement age to 63 for women. They took it from 55, which is quite low, to 60. And from 60 for men to 65, and they'll phase that in, increasing the age 6 months a year, every year until they get to those ages, right? And so in some ways, this is a big reversal, because Putin had openly promised. Oh, did I step in something I wasn't supposed to? He had promised not to do this. Is it the cord? Okay. Had promised not to do this. But it's not the first time that Putin has made a big reversal in pension policy. And so there's a policy that I'm going to guess even in this audience people know less about for good reason, which is there was a reform called pension privatization. I think there are similarities between the reversal and that kind of reform and raising the retirement age. And I wrote a book about the reversals in pension policy in post-communist countries that came out in 2017. And in Russia, they had introduced this in 2001, and then they start reversing it in 2012. And you can see here what I've put up is just this bar graph where for the Russian state pension fund deficit, the projections are it would go up and up and up, and the actual deficit was even higher than the projections. They reverse pension privatization, or start reversing it, in 2012. 2013, we see they kill the deficit for a year, it drops back down. But by 2014, it's already starting to shoot back up and has continued to increase since then. And so the similarity that I see between pension privatization and this is that social policy and pension policy is the purview of elites in Russia. It's not that they don't care about public opinion, but someone else who presented said something about authoritarian regimes being, the responsiveness of authoritarian regimes. They are responsive in a sense, but only to a point. In this case, the public didn't know and largely didn't care about this. In the pension case, 90% or more of the Russian public was opposed to raising the age. In both cases, the elites did what they wanted to, right? Now, this reform they could do when they felt like it. The other, raising the retirement age, they did wait until after the election and do it during the World Cup. They were strategic, but they still did largely what they wanted and what made sense for them. And so the Russian public is understandably skeptical about getting certain benefits and the quality of them. Live fast, die young. It's a satirical version, it's not real, a satirical version of an ad from the pension fund of Russia. We can't afford you, so die young. There's another really good one that has Pushkin, and it's a famous painting of Pushkin in the duel that kills him. It says, Pushkin was killed at 37, what have you done for your country? So Russians are skeptical about this. This is not a Western stereotype that things aren't going great all the time. This is from just a couple years ago. So in the run-up to the recent election, who's that going out? Is the patient saying, and the doctor says, that's your health. And that was published in Pravda in January of 2017. So Russians are skeptical, and they're skeptical for good reasons. If we just look at cursory spending data, this is just the available data from the World Development Indicators on spending as a percentage of GDP, then you can see here that spending is either decreasing or stagnating in recent years. There's some missing data there. And I would also note that this is lower than European averages. So Russia's spending also, not only are they not increasing spending, which a lot of countries, you're not seeing a dramatic line go up, right, and increases, but you don't usually see it go down, and they're already a lot lower than their European counterparts. So they're really not investing a lot in education and healthcare. This table here is based on an article that was published in Vedomosti in 2017, so a year before the election. And what you can see, even from a quick glance, is that, and this is from a Russian newspaper again, which was a critical article saying 10 unfulfilled promises of Putin and Medvedev. The best they get is mixed results on a couple things at the top. The rest of their social promises, Vedomosti, the authors are claiming they did not fulfill. I added, don't raise the retirement age. That isn't in the original table. And that, as of 2017, was the only promise they had kept. And then after Putin gets reelected in 2018, they raised the retirement age. So the big question, I think, for a lot of people that gets raised is, are stagnating conditions in education and healthcare, are the fact that they raise the retirement age and people aren't happy about it, is that going to hurt Putin's popularity? And the answer, I think, is, I mean, this is very speculative on my part, and this again, so this is just telling you, this is survey data from the run-up to 2018, what Putin would have been looking at as he was getting his campaign ready. What problems do you find most concerning? So if you look at the bottom there, the top 5 that are listed, the largest percentage found them most concerning, none of those are social policy provision. Right? And it's not that they don't care about it. Access to education and healthcare are on there. But inflation, poverty, unemployment, corruption, economic crisis, they care more about the general conditions and less about the policies that might address those general conditions, or might affect them, but those general conditions are predominant. So I'm not sure that we should, I think it would be premature to say this is going to bring Putin down. He also has a lot of time to distract people away from raising the retirement age. Right? There's a reason you do this right after you get reelected, and you can wait a bit till the next local elections. Well, now he can wait a bit till the next local elections, but wait certainly to the end of his term, which is 6 years. And so, just very quickly, because I think I'm out of time, really. He's promised a bunch of social spending, right? And this is not surprising. So, Putin is doing more of the same. This is a picture from 2007 where he's visiting a school in Astrakhan. But he's promised to spend more on schools and education, and really specific promises. So 40% more on daycares, double investment in urban renewal, double the amount of money that you spend on roads and infrastructure. So really specific spending promises, which means he would end up just fine probably. Or he may. I mean, this is all speculative and probabilistic, but he's got lots of time to, he's promised a lot. He might do some of it, and that might be enough, right? Because I think the big takeaway here is Putin is strategic. That's not going to be a surprise to anyone. But he'll do enough of the right things at the right times for the right people that people aren't too upset, right? It's not the kind of long-term social policy planning we might hope for. It's going to be like right before an election, maybe you give people pension payments, which is what they've done before every presidential election, is make extra payments. So he may end up just fine in the end, despite the fact that conditions are. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and so our final author presenting today is Judyth Twigg of Virginia Commonwealth University. Oh, yeah.
I'm going to talk about a very specific case study that harks back to some of the comments that Brian made earlier this morning about flatlining trends in administrative competence and managerial capacity. The story of HIV/AIDS in Russia is one that takes that up an order of magnitude or two. The story of policy toward HIV/AIDS in Russia is one of willful incompetence and neglect. And it says a lot, I think, about the way that Russia is using policy in some areas as a tool in its narrative about Western attitudes and Western behaviors in a lot of contexts that may prove counterproductive in the long run. So the takeaway from the next 7.5 minutes is that Russia is facing a rising and serious HIV/AIDS epidemic. This is an epidemic that is addressable through policy change. But right now it is being used as a tool in the Kremlin's propaganda war against the West. And as a result, we're seeing some very serious public health and possibly societal consequences. So the epidemic of HIV in Russia passed the 1 million case mark back in 2015. It's been rising significantly since then. In fact, HIV/AIDS in every other part of the world has been in decline over the last few years. The Eastern European region is the only part of the world where HIV/AIDS continues to grow, and Russia is overwhelmingly responsible for that growth in Eastern Europe. HIV is now a leading cause of mortality and lost life years in Russia. It's the leading cause of infectious disease death in the country. AIDS now kills more people than any form of cancer except lung cancer in Russia. So we're starting to see the cases of HIV that spiked back in 1999 through 2001, went through a bit of a lull for almost a decade, but then started to accelerate pretty dramatically again in 2012, 2013. We're starting to see those cases of HIV produce significant mortality from the AIDS that results. It hits some demographic groups more than others. It's most prominent among men in their 30s. HIV prevalence among men in their 30s is somewhere between 3 and 3.5% of the population. And among young people in the 18 to 24 age cohort, it's primarily a female epidemic now. We're used to thinking of the HIV epidemic as predominantly among male drug users in Russia, but increasingly we're starting to see the epidemic, we think, among the sex partners, the female sex partners of those drug users. And so among the young people, it's becoming a more and more feminized epidemic. And globally, best practice against HIV involves a two-pronged strategy. A strategy of prevention, keeping people from becoming infected with HIV to begin with, and treatment, successful treatment of people who are infected with HIV to keep them from developing AIDS and therefore keep them from dying. Treatment is fairly straightforward, and it's been the leading cause of success in the fight against the epidemic globally. Treatment involves the provision of what's known as antiretroviral medication. It's a medication that doesn't have to be expensive anymore. The poorest of the poor countries in the world now buy ARVs, antiretroviral medications, for their people for on the order of $100, $150 per year per person. So this is something that's affordable even for the less economically developed countries in the world. And if you're on a successful regime of ARVs, Your life can be prolonged indefinitely. As far as we know, people on ARVs who adhere to the treatment live life expectancies as full as people who are not HIV infected. And the other important thing about successful treatment with ARVs is that it brings the viral load in your bloodstream down to 0, which means not only are you treated, but you're incapable of passing the virus on to anyone else through any form of transmission. And so globally, the HIV epidemic is coming under control. And I don't want to overstate the optimism here. There are still many, many barriers to beating HIV. But around the world, we've managed to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars through organizations like Bill Gates and others who have contributed to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, through the World Bank, through the incredibly generous United States PEPFAR program. We're bringing HIV numbers down around the world largely through successful provision of antiretroviral medications. But there's another prong to the strategy, and that strategy is prevention. We can't treat our way out of the epidemic largely because it's expensive to do that. It's not a cost-effective strategy. And so we need to have provisions in place that keep people from getting HIV infected to begin with. And there are a couple of very logical policies that you can put in place to make this happen, most of which involve reaching out to the people who are most likely to contract HIV. So you reach out to communities of men who have sex with men, gay men. You reach out to communities of people who use injected drugs. You reach out to communities of people who are mostly vulnerable, marginalized, whose behavior and in many cases their very identity is either looked down upon or in many cases criminalized in countries around the world. And so what we've learned over the decades of dealing with HIV is that the most successful way of doing prevention, of getting prevention messages out to those vulnerable groups and to those risk groups, is through peer-to-peer outreach, through non-governmental organizations, because by definition, most of these people are with good reason mistrustful of government and of government-sponsored programs. And so we've learned that governments and international organizations need to work with civil society. They need to work with NGOs. They need to reach out through peer-to-peer contact to the people who are most vulnerable. So here's where we run headlong into Russian policy, which does pretty much everything exactly backwards in terms of best case international practice for dealing with HIV. First of all, as we all know, Russian government policy is actively hostile toward civil society and toward non-governmental organizations, and it's especially hostile toward foreign funding of those organizations. So part of the reason that the HIV epidemic went into recession in the 2000s in Russia was because of international intervention to support a very courageous, very active civil society in Russia that was able to reach out with these prevention messages, with treatment strategies for the sex workers, for the people who were injecting drugs, for the men who were having sex with men in Russia. Starting in 2011, 2012, all of that support went away. USAID left, DFID left, the Global Fund left. The support strategies that were bolstering civil society dealing with HIV/AIDS and with drug users in Russia literally fell off the map. So the number of NGOs in Russia that are supporting HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment programs went from hundreds to in the dozens now. And those groups are almost all on the foreign agents list. They're all fighting death by inspection, death by bureaucratization. They're finding the environment within which they can operate seriously constrained. They're not able to have a significant impact anymore. The government does support some NGOs that reach out with treatment of people who are already infected. You know, they care about the mothers and babies. They care about all of the population groups that are culturally acceptable within the Russian context. And hats off to the Russian Orthodox Church for the work that it does in providing treatment services to people who are already infected with HIV/AIDS. They do a reasonable job there. But the fight against NGOs with the Russian government and the deliberate policies that are in place in Russia to criminalize and have harsh practices toward the very vulnerable groups who are most likely to contract and spread HIV/AIDS are harsh. So the anti-gay propaganda law back in 2013 has pushed men who have sex with men even farther underground, so it's harder to reach that population with prevention and treatment services. And then most importantly, in the Russian context, the policies toward drug users. Drug use is dealt with through a criminal justice rather than a public health approach in Russia. If you are an active drug user, the last thing you want to do is seek treatment through government vehicles. The government approach to drug treatment basically boils down to chain you to a radiator and we'll see what happens. So that the vast majority of people who are apprehended for drug use will choose incarceration over treatment. And of the people who go into government-sponsored treatment programs in Russia, only about 1% of those people are successfully treated in the long term. So this is a population that is forced further and further underground, and perhaps most importantly, they are not given access to any of the international best practice methods for dealing with drug use. Syringe exchange programs, needle exchange programs are illegal in Russia, and what's called opioid substitution therapy or opioid agonist therapy, methadone, other drugs that are known, again, through an overwhelming amount of global best practice scientific evidence are illegal in Russia. So the Russian authorities say that methadone is simply replacing one addiction with another. They say that it will just lead to addiction to methadone. They say that it's just a gift to international pharmaceutical companies. They say that it'll create black markets in methadone and the other opioid replacement drugs. But literally, there is nothing to Russian government claims that somehow Russian addicts are different from addicts in the rest of the world. There's nothing to Russian government claims that somehow there is a unique scientific situation that only Russian narcologists have a handle on, and they have a key to the Russian addiction problem that's different than that in the rest of the world. Instead, Russian policy across the board, whether it's addiction, whether it's sexual minority status and behavior, whether it's sex workers who are vulnerable to HIV infection, the Russian government puts it all under the umbrella of a fight against the intrusion of Western liberal values, a return to Russian cultural values of being morally upstanding, adhering to centuries and millennia of Russian culture, all of which go against best practice internationally, and they go against every shred of evidence that we have about how you go about fighting an HIV epidemic. So I'll conclude with a good news, bad news observation. The good news is that this is an epidemic that is amenable to policy change. There is a very straightforward set of steps that the Russian government could take. There are policy levers that are firmly within their grasp that could reverse the tide of this epidemic the same way that the tide of the epidemic appears to be reversing in the rest of the world. The bad news is that there's absolutely no sign that this is going to happen, that Russia remains stubbornly, obstinately dug in to its current bad practice, and that is bad news for Russian public health.
So to kind of round off the panel, we have Wayne Mary, who has graciously agreed to discuss all 5 papers from the American Foreign Policy Council.
Thank you, Henry. The advantage of being a discussant is you only have to read papers, you don't actually have to write any of them, let alone do a PowerPoint presentation. My first point is I want to emphasize that this panel is the most important of the 4. Most people looking at today's program would say, well, the first panel is about politics, the third is economics, and the fourth is foreign policy. So they squeezed in this business about society and culture, just to sort of fill out the morning. Wrong. Societal and cultural issues are the dynamic within a country from which the political, economic, and foreign policy stuff derives. I mean, I remember very well during my first assignment at Embassy Moscow in the early 80s being given a hard time at lunch by one of my colleagues who covered arms control because he said that the work I was doing was essentially frivolous, fun but frivolous, that my issues were nationalism and religion, and everybody knew that those were totally irrelevant in the Soviet Union and could have no possible impact on the national interest of the United States. So let's look at some of the interesting group of policy issues, policy-related issues we have here. One is that of memory politics in Russia, particularly among younger people who inevitably look back on the 90s because that's the period they can remember. And even if you look at broader, what I would call, living memory, which includes your parents and your grandparents, the 90s are increasingly becoming kind of the focus of that. And I quite agree with the paper's division of attitudes towards that, of a larger one, official one, of looking at the 90s as one of collective trauma of Russian society. and a smaller group who focus on what the paper talks about is the explosion of creativity during that period. And both were certainly present. I would just posit that one way to look at that period from an outsider's point of view, and this was actually the term I used in trying to explain it to Washington in the 90s, was that what Russia was undergoing was the immigrant experience. Is that people were moving from one country, the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, to another country, post-Soviet Russia. And that what we were observing was essentially a mass, collective, and usually involuntary immigrant experience. And that as Americans, with a lot of background in the immigrant experience, we should be able to understand why, for individuals, for families, for the society as a whole, this is a very disruptive, challenging, sometimes liberating, but often unpleasant thing to go through. And if you look at the history of almost any immigrant group who came to the United States or to other immigrant countries, you'll find these same kinds of social traumas, these same kinds of intergenerational issues, these same kinds of looking back on the old country with nostalgia. And in fact, we know from history that roughly 1/3 of the people who've ever come to the United States have gone back to the old country. And it's not surprising that there are a lot of people in Russia and other countries who want to go back to the old country, the Soviet Union. Well, the only way to do that is through political methods, political change. That's how you try to go back to the old country. And I would just suggest the immigrant experience collectively is a way of appreciating what's happened in Russia in the 90s and beyond. And not just Russia, but it explains a lot about the experience of places like Poland and Hungary and East Germany and others. And that as Americans who do have a considerable amount of collective experience ourselves in this way, we should perhaps be a little more understanding, sympathetic, or at least empathetic to this. Now, looking at the shoreless Russia, well, I mean, that term really, got the hairs on the back of my neck. It sounds like a risky mirror to me. But what it reflects to me is two characteristics of Russians abroad. The first, the mass of Russians who are politically relatively worthless. I mean, one thing we know is that when Russians come to the United States, they look after themselves, and they are perhaps the least politically energetic immigrant group in our country today. I mean, if you compare them to relatively small countries, like Georgia or Armenia, or even big countries like Poland or Ukraine, I mean, the Russians really just even are not on the chart. But then you have the small group of Russians who are politically active, who remind me of what my former professor, like James Billington, used to say, was that intellectuals are the least politically responsible component of the Russian political demographic. He reminded me of this old 19th century definition of a Russian intellectual is a person who lets the outhouse in Outback collapse from lack of maintenance while sitting inside coming up with schemes for universal peace and brotherhood. And I was reminded of that in some of the descriptions that the paper contains of what people are talking about in this Russian political diaspora. I mean, it reminded me very much of the white Russians in the 20s in Paris, and perhaps even more of some of the Cuban immigration in Miami, who the last thing in the world wanted was to see reform in Cuba, was to see the Castro regime loosen up, to see people actually live better in Cuba. No, what they wanted was for everything to get worse so that there could be another revolution, which they, of course, would either really benefit from. And I see these quotations in the paper about awaiting regime crack, and seeing that as the precursor to a revolution which would involve, of course, considerable bloodshed, and sort of wondering exactly how you can project from that a better Russia in the future. And I think it does reflect the extent to which some of these intellectuals, not all, but some of them, talk in terms that are extraordinarily condescending. One basically saying that there's not a single person in Russia it's worth me talking to. 140 million people, there's nobody it's worth my time to communicate. Then I was very, very intrigued by the paper comparing United Russia with the PRI. And I think it's partly because we as Americans should keep in mind that 100 years ago, there were two very bloody, very violent civil wars going on. One was in Russia, the other was in Mexico. And they both produced very interesting outcomes of great importance for the United States. One of the things the Mexican Revolution produced was the PRI, the institutionalized revolutionary party. In a sense, a Leninist party, but a Leninist party who understood that its job was to prevent the emergence of a Stalin. Their historical experience with Porfirio Diaz meant that the PRI made damn sure that they were a ruling party who occasionally put somebody in office rather than being a party of a ruler. And this was a fundamental distinction between the Mexican experience and the Russian. Now, what we see today, of course, is that the PRI has gone its historical cycle of corruption and mismanagement, abuse of power, and now has made way for a left-wing populist nationalist in the person of Mr. Lopez Obrador, simultaneously with coming to power of a right-wing populist nationalist in Brazil, and that's an interesting comparison to watch. But what I think is most interesting right now is that Mr. Lopez Obrador and his party have in many ways a broader control of Mexican political institutions than Putin and United Russia have, and are perhaps in a better position to try to bring their reforms into some kind of reality. Whereas in some ways, I think looking at the Russian case, you're looking at a party which, since it is not a ruling party but a party of the rulers, may be approaching its own exhaustion of political utility. Now, on social policy, the only thing I would note is that with the May decrees from last year, we actually do have metrics upon which Putin can be judged in his final term of office. I mean, the May decrees have 9 national goals up until 2024 and 12 national projects, and many of these are extremely detailed. And in principle, there's a ton of money going to be committed to them, 18% of GDP. I mean, that's real money. God knows what's going to happen to that real money. And as someone who's old enough to remember the 12th five-year plan of the Soviet Union, I approach this all with a great deal of skepticism. But nonetheless, what Putin and his associates have done since their election is to present to the Russian people a series of commitments, promises, aspirations, which are quantifiable, accessible, and can actually be judged. I'm not quite sure why they would do that. I would be very reluctant about committing myself to achieving even half the things that they're talking about in more than very general terms, whereas many of these are really quite specific. And I think it will be a very interesting thing to see to what extent not only any of these commitments are achieved, but to what extent the lack of achievement of them becomes politically important in the years ahead. Finally, Judyth's paper. If you read only one of the Ponar's papers from today's session, read this one. If it doesn't depress you, there's something wrong with it. It's a dreadful story. Beautifully told, but a dreadful story. And I want to just discuss it within a broader context of other work that Judyth has done that shows that in some areas of health policy, there's actually been good news and progress in Russia. I mean, it's not all bad news. For example, there has been significant progress in childhood health issues. Seeing to it that kids get calcium and get their shots and get vitamins and minerals and all that kind of thing. There has been some improvement among a narrower demographic, which is to say urban middle-class people, in cardiovascular and cerebrovascular health, which is to say lifestyle issues, where a lot of people in urban Russia are behaving better and reaping the health benefits from that. Tuberculosis is an interesting case of good news, bad news. The incidence of tuberculosis has gone down, but among those who do have tuberculosis, the incidence of multi-drug resistance has gone up. Meaning, if you're Russian, you're less likely to get TB. If you get it, you're more likely to die from it. But when you get to the HIV/AIDS, there is no good news, bad news. It's really dreadful. And as Judyth points out, this is a matter of result of public policy. You compare it with any other country in the world, not just developed countries, compare it with India, you compare it with South Africa, you compare it with Uganda, it's all dreadful. And in health issues anywhere in the world, there are instances where policy failure achieves the level of criminal negligence. And I think, no question, HIV policy in Russia is at that level. But what is most depressing to me is that societal attitudes mean it's probably going to stay there. Because societal attitudes towards the most vulnerable groups is also intolerant. And it's only perhaps when you get a really major increase in transmission by heterosexual transmission, and you start getting levels of HIV infection in Russia at the levels that South Africa once experienced, that this may change. And that's really bad news.
Thank you. A remarkable amount of ground in precisely the amount of allotted time. So let's open it up and take a few questions from the floor before we give our panelists a chance to respond. So if you can just introduce yourself, please, and wait for the microphone. Yeah.
Marjorie Mandelstown-Balzer, Georgetown University. I have a question for Gulnaz. Can you take your cogent analysis of the 90s and memory politics into issues of the non-Russians and the republics, and talk a little bit, especially about Tatarstan, in case I know you know well, but also others, in terms of how that delicate balance mix between the official line and the non-official line plays out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. This was really illuminating. My name is Mindy Reiser. I've worked in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and also in higher education. Sarah, I'm very interested in your paper. I work in social policy. And maybe in the future there'll be increases in support for education, but why not more and why not earlier? This is the seed corn. If Russia is to be the great big power that Putin lusts for, you need development in science and technology. You need young people trained in good elementary and secondary schools. So I don't understand the rationale for the decrease in that vital area. Not to mention the DoD types in the Russian equivalent of the Pentagon.
Yes.
Anders Rosman, further on this, both Sarah's and Judyth's papers show wonderfully dictators don't care about the population. They care about the upper class. If you look up on Kazakhstan, not to mention Azerbaijan, it's far worse. This is a sign of the people don't have a voice. You have the numbers for healthcare expenditure of 3.5% of GDP. It's 9% on average in the European Union. Kyrgyzstan has better health statistics than far richer Kazakhstan. So this is just straightforward. The dictatorship doesn't care about the population, neither when it comes to education. In most cases, the Soviet Union was actually an exception measure, but the Soviet Union spent extremely, I think, 2% of GDP on healthcare. So they didn't care about that at all. Just wanted to say on Gulnaz, I think this is wonderfully important. I think that until Russians understand the 1990s, Russia will not become a healthy society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more before we turn it back to the yeah, right. Yes.
My question is for Andrey. How do you see those conducting politics from abroad adapting in light of the undesirable law and the recent arrest of an Open Russia activist? And the second part of the question is the fact that these individuals operate from cities like Washington and London, does that further discredit them by supporting the Kremlin narrative?
Okay, thank you. So let's turn back to our panel. Let's just go for simplicity in the order in which they presented. So let's start with Gulnaz. Please try to keep it brief so we can have another round or two of questions. Thanks.
Yes, actually let me first start with Anders' comment about the importance of the 90s and about the people understanding the 90s correctly. Now, I would point out that it's about how the elites presented the 1990s, and that they've reached out and connected with a very soft emotional spot, while at the point of economic growth in the 2000s, they might have used the 90s as, yes, we all went through shared pain, but it worked out, we had to go through it so that the growth will be possible, so that the trickling down economic growth, development, modernization would be possible in the 2000s. So that moment when that type of, the provisions, the structural economic provisions for something of the sort of a German economic miracle of the 60s, Japanese economic miracle of the 60s happened, and that was used to legitimize the changes, post-war changes in Germany and Japan were used for creating symbolic capital for the new regime. In Russia was used in the opposite way. So sort of societal emotions, experiences are in a way manipulated for political purposes by those who don't believe in the original reforms. And for Margie, I think you were asking about the balance. So the idea of the 90s is being used to unify the Russian population across all the national, ethnic minorities borders. And the power of this discourse is that it is shared and it resonates. It resonates powerfully in, whether you are in Tatarstan, in Bashkortostan, or in Moscow. Actually, less so in Moscow than in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. It resonates much more in the periphery, right? Because Moscow was the winners of the 1990s. Now, I think what you want me to talk about is about the more recent symbolic policies coming from the Kremlin that undermined the certain ethnic language rights in Russia, and thus causing sort of concern and big concern in the population. I think that if merged with economic decline, right, people are unhappy due to economic conditions, and if these symbolic issues are brought to them by their regional elites, then the situation becomes explosive. So that's why what Putin is doing with regional elites and the relations that have been formed so far in terms of controlling the elites is really important. So, so at this point, I don't see any big moves from regional elites to use the potential for political explosion in the regions. At this point, it's not there. The elites have been pacified, have been co-opted, have been are controlled, but the symbolic policies that went against ethnic minority languages are there and create potential structural political issue that could be mobilized by counter elites in the regions. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrey.
Well, first of all, a very short remark to weigh in on this shortless Russia. I think as a cultural metaphor, it can be valid, it can be functional, but as a political slogan, no, of course. And how to prevent this cultural metaphor into, being transformed into political concept? Well, I know, because the concept of the Russian world initially in late 1990s started as an attempt to inscribe Russia into the globalization debate with the state-diaspora relations, and referring to experience of other countries. It ended up with Donbass and Crimea, etc., just a matter of decay. So even if you have a cultural concept that is hijacked by the authorities, the politicization is inevitable, and I suspect that something like that might happen with this idea of shortless Russia. Even if the producers of this idea, like Makarychev, even if they did not imply those political meaning, that's just how it works. On undesirable organizations, well, of course, the strategy of the Kremlin is to keep all this network of institutions and organizations and foundations as way as possible from Russia. In the most recent case of the arrest of Russian activist, the mother of three, not first of two, is very illustrative of that kind of policy of keeping them aloof, of trying to construct this political border. On whether they discredit themselves operating from the outside. Well, I know in the eyes of whom. I mean, if it's about ordinary people, well, I suspect that they might not even be aware of this type of activity, frankly speaking. But there is an interesting polemics between policy activists within Russia who claim that that's exactly them who do politics by trying to change not the regime, but some practices from the inside, and the opposition from the outside would say that what you are doing is just fighting for color of the benefits you are allowed to use. So this is an interesting debate on how politics is understood. Now I would be happy to keep an eye on that kind of quite unusual exchange of remarks and conflictual interaction between the two. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly.
I'll just thank Wayne for adding on the older history and the more recent history of the story I told. So thank you for your comments.
Sarah.
So I'll address I think the first question I got first, the one about why doesn't Putin want to give more money to science and education and modernization? And I think he does, actually, in principle. I think it's just that he may care about more things more, right? And so it's not that he doesn't want science and technology. I mean, openly has said we need to modernize the country, invest in this, and they do have initiatives to do that, and there's some vocational education initiatives that Thomas Remington and Israel Marquise write about that are pilot programs with business and the state where those aren't science and technology, I think, in the sense that maybe you're referring to it, but those vocational education initiatives are designed to match the labor force better with the businesses that want to be there. I think it's just that if you look at overall spending, they care about other things more. And so Anders Aslan's point about if it's a sign that authoritarian leaders don't care about their population, I think that's partially right. I think they do care in some ways, but it's that they care more about not having opposition than having popular support. Or like the barrier is different, right? Like you do an unpopular thing right after the election because you don't want a big blow, but you do care about the blowback, right? But so they'd love to be popular, right? It's just there's certain priorities, like maybe your cronies getting money is more important than spending a whole lot on education, even if in principle you'd like to modernize the country. And the last thing I'll just add very quickly is, so thank you very much to Wayne and Mary for these comments. And you posed this very good question of why do this really specific set of concrete metrics that you can have to judge Putin by. And I think the answer is why not? It's what they did before. They did it in 2005 with the Council of National Projects. They did it in 2012. In 2012, Putin promised to build 1,000 new schools. He didn't do it. But the papers that take a more positive assessment will just say, well, look, compared to the 90s, it's still so much better, right? They won't say compared to 2012, you just move the point of comparison back. And so it really made me think of this when you were giving your talk, that, why not, politicians promise things all the time. They can figure out what to do when they don't deliver it later, right? But why not promise it now? And it's more credible if it's really specific.
Great, thanks, Judy.
To Anders' point about dictators not caring about their population, narrowly on the HIV/AIDS question, it's interesting that the other dictators in the region at least bend on this a little bit. All the other countries legalize methadone, even though Russia has leaned on some of them really hard to reverse policy and get in line with the Kremlin here. But more broadly, for a dictator who doesn't care about his population, Putin sure does talk about health and demography a lot, especially over the last few years. And we might speculate that part of that is just the optics, right? It doesn't look good for a superpower to have a declining population that's still experiencing some elements of decay. There's also an economic motivation, right? You know, it's hard to successfully diversify beyond natural resource extraction if you don't have the healthy, appropriately educated and trained labor force to make that happen. And maybe that's not really a goal. You know, maybe it's harder to run your kleptocracy off of a more broadly based economy, but if you do want to go in the direction of a more modern economy, you need the demographic base on which to make that happen. So it's a mixed set of signals, I agree, that we see coming out of the Kremlin. In terms of health spending, you know, as you say, they have invested you know, quite a bit in a number of different health initiatives going back to 2005, 2006, and the first set of national projects up to various, you know, vertical and more broadly based programs in the health and education sectors over the last decade or so. But I want to get the argument in that in the Russian case, it's not just the amount of money that they're spending, it's how they're spending the money that they have. And a huge amount of the money is getting lost to corruption. Obviously, that's an important part of the story, but an equally important part of the story is the gross inefficiency with which they spend the money that they're investing. And part of this, 25 years later, goes back to holdover ways of thinking and incentive structures from the old Soviet system. And granted, more narrowly in the health sector, they've spent some money wisely. They've put in all kinds of international best practice restrictions on sale, advertising, marketing of alcohol and tobacco products that, as Wayne tells us, have really made a dent in mortality from cardiovascular disease, especially among men in urban areas. They invested in a complete revamping of the ambulance fleet that went a huge way toward decreasing deaths from emergency situations, from road accidents and other kinds of emergency causes. So, you know, hats off to them when they've managed to do those things well targeted and well spent. But there's an enormous amount of money that's just being thrown away because they're not targeting it in the right places. And so it's another example, back to Brian's original point, of just administrative incompetency, managerial inefficiency that they still just don't have right.
Okay, terrific, thank you. So let's take another round of questions. I'll try to see.
Harley Balzer, Georgetown University. One small footnote for Judy: if anybody's not convinced about how fundamentalist they are on the AIDS, when Russia took over Crimea, you would think there was a lot they needed to do. One of the first things was to close down the methadone clinics and the needle exchanges and cause an increase in HIV infection in Crimea. But my real question is for Kelly. Mexico and Russia both fall into the category of Turi Lynn-Carl's large population oil exporters. They both have a lot of corruption connected with the hydrocarbons. In Russia's case, it's highly centralized. In Mexico's case, as we're learning with the lines at the gas stations right now, it's much more democratized. It's you know, people bunkering, as the Nigerians call it, stealing out of the lines rather than the central governments. But I'm wondering if you could add that at all to the comparison.
Yeah.
Oh, she did.
Sorry.
Dan Boulder, Department of Defense. Just to pick up on Judy's paper, I realize this is a Russia symposium today, but there are consequences for all of the rest of us when it comes to the failure to deal with HIV, for example. Harley talked about what happened when they went into Crimea. They haven't gone into Western Ukraine, and yet the strains of HIV that are now showing up in Western Ukraine can be traced back to the Donbass. So it really matters. Tuberculosis, the co-infection rates are very high. And when you don't allow people to exchange needles, you are asking for an explosion in all three types of hepatitis, and that spreads as well.
Thanks.
Dmitry Kolokovsky, Maurice Minister Service. My question is mainly to Gulnaz. You highlighted the apparent contradiction between the memory politics and the legitimacy that the government tries to draw from the collective trauma of the 1990s and the nostalgia that certain generations may be feeling towards 1990s. I was wondering if there are any other dimensions of memory politics where you see contradictions. And one dimension that comes to my mind is the memory of Great Patriotic War and the victory that the government used to its advantage to draw legitimacy from there. Do you see that rhetoric around the victory resonating with the young generation? And do you see this the fault lines in the memory politics spreading to other areas and potentially creating a failure of the government's attempts to use memory politics to its advantage?
Okay, Kathy and then Kirill.
Kathy Kozman, I agree with Wayne that this is by far the most important session. I wish there had been a speaker on non-Russian within Russia, but that's another point. On education, if education is so important, and obviously it is, why is there a Russian Orthodox zealot who is, as far as I know, in charge of education, at least nominally, and also couldn't emigre groups and others within the opposition use the decline in the standards of education and certainly access to education as a way of garnering popular support? I've raised this question with the opposition directly, and I didn't get a very satisfactory answer. Thank you.
And just right here, yeah.
Thank you. It's maybe more comment than question. It deals with fascinating Sarah presentation, but it's a very important problem. That follows from my presentation. I also do not expect some regime breakdown because of pension reforms. But we also should take into consideration that we do not see yet the consequences of the reform. The matter is that Russian statistics on employment is useless, wrong, and so we actually do not know the real tension on the labor market, especially in small and middle towns. In this situation, pensions, this for women from 55 and for men from 60s, were a sort of fee, a sort of guarantee income for those people. And when we move the age of pension, we increase the tension on labor market in these in small and middle cities. And we'll see in 3 or 4 years what real situation is there, especially if the stagnation will continue. It could lead to very painful consequences.
As well to stay on the side of you.
Yes, thank you. My question also to Sarah. So have you heard about Profsayuz Navalny, trade union of Alexei Navalny that was established recently on January 24? So actually this is a tool, a political tool to convert public discontent with social policy into political capital of this. So what I'm trying to say, while there is no direct challenge to the regime through this social unsuccessful and unpopular social policies, there is a growing discontent among Russian population with the social policy, which is accumulating and which can be used by politicians and increasingly used by politicians.
Okay, do we have any more? I think we can take probably one more, and then we'll turn it back to the panel.
Thank you. I have a question to Judyth in a couple of remarks. Is Russia unique in its stance on methadone? And if so, how do you explain that? Because this is something that has always puzzled me. And the other question is, are there patterns similar to Russia's, or probably was there a pattern in HIV patterns similar to Russia's today in terms of categories, etc.? A comment to Gulnaz. Well, your point about the 90s is, of course, extremely important. And I think in responding to one of the questions, you said that this is how the elites framed it. I think that I would paraphrase Bill Clinton. It's politics stupid. This is what, this was the most natural step for Putin's government when he had inherited a country in which all institutions were absolutely unpopular. Yeltsin had just narrowly escaped impeachment. The emotion was there about the 90s, no question about that. So the regime capitalized on the pre-existing conditions, so to say. and tapped into the sentiment that had already been there, which was a very natural thing to do. To expect, as Andrey suggested, that the Russian population should understand the 90s, I would add, to understand the 90s as the beneficiaries understood them at the time. So I think this is an important factor. And tapping into pre-existing perceptions is something that the Kremlin has done quite effectively. And of course, the 90s is not the only thing. And my other comment is to Sarah. I think I cannot agree more with the way you described the situation with pension reform. One point that I would disagree with is that the reform came as unexpected. There have been a lot of focus groups, including those commissioned by the government, and those who conducted those focus groups had the impression that people pretty much expected that. And the point was that once the issue is raised even by a pollster, even by a moderator, this means, of course, they will do it because means that they planned it. And whatever they plan, they will do. There is, and I think you mentioned, you had this word skeptical, which I think is very important in understanding. I just want to quote somebody who I think worded it in a very succinct way. The expectation that the state should assume responsibility for social protection are gigantic, as is the conviction that the state will not live up to these expectations. I think this is very well put, and this explains why the reaction was the way that it was. People assumed that the reform will be adopted, and they also assumed it would be softened and that Putin would do that. And that was exactly what happened. We will see whether the mechanisms that Kay mentioned will be at play in the coming years.
Okay, great. So keeping in mind that lunch comes after this panel ends, I'd like to give each panelist, including Wayne if he wants, 1 to 2 minutes to comment, and maybe Sarah could take a little bit more since she got a whole lot of questions if she wants to address it. But maybe for simplicity's sake, we can just start with the Gulnaz and kind of just go in order like this. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll respond to 2 things. Dmitry, thank you for raising the issue of memory politics. And indeed, 90s is not the only big chunk of Putin's memory politics. In fact, you brought up the second extremely important part, which is World War II. And actually, I wasn't presenting memory politics about the 90s as a point of contradiction, but rather as the Kremlin establishing or working with what's emotionally resonant, and then the grassroots sort of counter-mobilization, partially institutionally also determined by the Yeltsin Center, to that dominant narrative. And not everyone agrees with it, and those who've experienced the excitement, the enthusiasm, the freedom, the creativity, especially in Moscow, say, right? I mean, we are really missing that, what was there in the 1990s. So it's not so much contradiction, but the flow of political sentiments and the reaction from those who disagree to the dominant narrative. Now, does the counter narrative resonate? To what extent does it resonate? And should the liberal opposition build on that or not is a separate question. And I would say that linking to Masha's comment, the opportunity for resonance there are few and little. And if anything, I would rather than picking struggle on that narrative, the agenda building on the liberal side should be something else to connect to the population on different issues rather than the 1990s. So I haven't thought through that idea, but I think it's not the battle worth picking at, but there should be a reorientation of the agenda rather than picking on that battle. So not so much contradiction, but the political struggle and what's at stake in this specific discursive frame. And I totally agree, Masha, with you on the natural choice that was made. I would also add that such choices and throwing the rascals out, those who promoted liberal reforms, occurred in many other Eastern European countries, and the 90s were hard not only in Russia, right? And the fact that Pavlovsky thought about it as an electoral strategy is very natural, right? But it is a puzzle how from an electoral strategy, the 90s after a few years, definitely after 10, 15 years, turned into a legitimation strategy. That's a very different thing, right? So I do see the possibility for the elites who came to power using the counter-90s, right? And Putin did follow with liberal reforms in the beginning. He was seen as a liberal, that he prefers economic liberalism at the beginning, right? So as the economic growth percolated, as it brought welfare to majorities, right? That success, economic success, could have been used to at least justify the post-Soviet Russia, the 1991 Russia, the choice made in the 1991. The point is that it was not done in that way, and so the Stalin popularity and sort of the post-Soviet nostalgia, I think, are linked to that ideological issues that, Putin was not, was not a Democrat.
So thanks to Harley for the question about the potential impact of different levels of centralization over natural resources in Mexico versus Russia. So we know the importance of that to the Russian government in terms of providing patronage, the utility of the state resources. In the accounts of the opposition gaining a foothold historically in Mexico, in the states, in municipalities, and then the states, and then eventually the presidency, I haven't seen the greater decentralization of natural resources as a contributing factor, but I will look for that. That's a really interesting point. And as a footnote, this is an academic project that's much larger, that looks at the subnational influences on democratization. So resource control is obviously an important part of that. Thank you.
So I'll try to be very brief, even though I got a lot of great questions to answer. So the first one was to the order of sort of why was that the pick for the head of Russian education? And I think that social policy in Russia is perplexing if you think that it's about the population, perhaps. So I say this because I was interviewing someone once about pension reform, and they said, but Sarah, you have to understand pension reform has nothing to do with pensioners. It has to do with future pensioners, and really even more broadly, it has to do with the pot of money, right? And so I think if you think Russian education has to do with students, it's perplexing maybe. But if you think that those ministerial positions are rewards for people that support you, or you think that social policy is a means of staying in power for an authoritarian leader, it's not perplexing, right? It's perplexing if you think it's sort of like an ideological goal to make things better. To some extent, that's true in even democratic countries, that politicians do things to stay in power and get support, right? It's not always about helping the person, but you've got to sort of align the short-term political incentives with what is also good policy, hopefully, right? And then for the Kirill's question about the consequences of reform and won't this build opposition, I could be wrong, but I'm skeptical. In part because they're raising it by 6 months every year, so it's being phased in. And Putin is already promising things like, we'll look at the indexation of pensions, we'll bump up some other benefits in the short term. So they can offset it by doing some fairly minimal other things to distract people like, oh, yeah, you've got to wait 6 more months, but it'll be a little higher, don't worry, right? And so I think they may be able to pull it off and do this without too much backlash. I think you're absolutely right, though, that it increases tension in the labor market, that it causes challenges for people. And then the question about the challenging, why aren't they using it to challenge the regime? They're trying to, right? So Navalny organized protests against raising the retirement age. They're definitely trying to capitalize on Putin doing something unpopular. And the big question now is how long and when, like how much can they get away with, how much can they do, how long can it stagnate before the comparison with the 90s isn't a compelling reference point anymore, right? It is still better than the 90s, but how long can that work, right? But they're definitely trying to capitalize on that, but because it's not a free media and it's not a free and fair system, it's hard to do that, right? The barriers are higher. And then the last question about, thank you very much for your comments. So you might be right, although in the sense that But people have long said they need to raise the retirement age in Russia. Part of the reason Putin had to publicly reassure people they weren't going to do it is because he had his own advisors telling him for a long time, you've got to raise the retirement age, it's really low, you have to raise it. So that may be partially right. And I think, you know, obviously I agree, right? The sort of like, there's a difference, a really important distinction between what you think the government should do and what you think the government really will do. And it's really about what you think they will do. And if they get partway to what they should do, maybe you're like, well, okay, maybe your expectations are really low for delivery. So, like, this is my ideal world, but I think I can only get here, and I got here, so it's not so bad.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Thanks, Masha, for the question on whether Russia is unique. These days, yes, but within a broader international context, it took a lot of countries a long time to get to the point of legalizing methadone. Even in the United States, there were parts of the country where it took a long time for the scientific evidence on needle exchange and methadone to sink in. And even in the region, you know, Uzbekistan's gone backwards, Kazakhstan's wavering right now, largely because Russia's pressuring them to go backward. But Russia's really using this issue as a hammer against Western values and, you know, Western infiltration, to the point that the United Nations bodies who are trying to bring Russia into the 21st century on this have used the metaphor of saying, you know, there are ways to fight drug addiction and HIV without using methadone, but it's really hard. It's as if someone said, go build me a dacha, but do it without using a hammer or nails or a saw. You can do it, but it's really hard. And what the Russians say, and again, I'm pulling off this UNODC spokesperson, who said it's as if the Russians have an old rusty chainsaw with just a few of its teeth left, and they're trying to use it to build that dacha. And you say, no, look, we have these nice brand new shiny efficient chainsaws that you could use, and the Russians would come back with, no, you know, Russian chainsaws are special, and Russian wood is special, and besides, we have all this evidence about how Russian chainsaws work better. We're not going to show any of that evidence to you, but we have it and we believe in it. And that's the quality of the discussion that's happening between Russia and all of the international public health bodies. And I think as long as you have a law enforcement culture and, you know, members of the Siloviki who are basically making policy for everything, you're going to be stuck in the rut.
Well, on education, as I understand, beyond Russia, well, that's not a strategy, but I can give just a couple of examples. For example, the Bristles of Fund a couple of times organized summer schools for it. It's about practical skills, but I think it's also part of education project in a wider sense. They also opened the Bristles of Center of Russian Studies at the Charles University in Prague, which might also be in the future somehow related to education. I don't know much about their activity. Maybe there's not much to say about that at this time, but yeah, there is some, you know, kind of first steps in this direction. And my second example would be Leonid Nevzin and his NATO Foundation that invests a lot in education, a lot on in academic exchange and programs basically related to studying the Jewish studies. But it's also a very important part of the Russian immigrant community. It was always like that. But it's I don't think it's systemic. I don't think it's structural. It's more like, you know, based on specific policies of specific foundations.
Wait. Since we got one question about cross-border disease transfers, I mean, this is an old issue. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we were told that HIV was not a Hindu disease, was not a Muslim disease. Hearing things from the government in South Africa, the government of Uganda, you know, not only unscientific, but criminally negligent. But one of the things we've learned is that one government being irresponsible in a highly infectious disease like HIV/AIDS can have transcontinental implications. I mean, diseases spread from South India into Iran, into Iraq, into Thailand, spread from parts across the whole width of Africa. And it basically, you know, comes down to the point that the virus doesn't give a damn about your borders, your politics, your religion, or your morality. And how difficult it can be to roll back policies that have gone into abeyance. I mean, in Ukraine, for example, in the 1990s, they had some really terrific policies on HIV/AIDS. And then along came the political battles of the Yushchenko years. Not the Yanukovych years, the Yushchenko years. And for reasons that had nothing to do with public policy, had everything to do with politics, all of those programs basically went into into disrepair. And how hard it is then to build back good practices and policies. We have a terrific health minister in Kiev today, but the work of trying to get back to where you were 20 years ago after several years of neglect is just incredibly difficult. We've seen this in lots of countries. I think one of the interesting things in Judyth's paper is that one of the places in Russia where they're doing really a lot to try to treat HIV/AIDS is Tatarstan. And if you can actually sort of get best practices in a place like Tatarstan, that might perhaps be more useful than lecturing people about the experience of Germany or the United States. But you know, a lot of this has to do with not only the science, but has to do with getting people to understand that the virus doesn't give a damn about your politics.
Okay, so let me just say, lunch we served sort of right outside the conference room, kind of in that back area. And just please join me in thanking our panelists.